imagine, if you will, waking up one morning and finding that the entire world as you know it has just been flipped completely upside down.
Right.
Like, imagine a reality where the fundamental institutions that have governed human civilization for centuries, the education system that teaches our kids, the media, the churches, even the very concept of the nuclear family.
Yeah.
Imagine they haven't just evolved, but they've been entirely captured, like dismantled and reassembled to serve a completely unrecognizable agenda.
It's a very intense premise.
It is. And welcome to another deep dive, by the way.
Yeah.
Today we're exploring a world where many feel that the ground beneath their feet is just totally shifting, where traditional values are under a relentless, highly coordinated siege.
That is quite the hook. And it really perfectly captures the urgency, the alarm, and the very specific worldview of the text we're going to unpack today.
Yeah, we have a fascinating one today.
We really do. We're going to be objectively deconstructing a very provocative, highly charged ebook. It's titled Stop the Leftist Wrecking Ball, A Guide to Defending Our Values, written by Conrad Riker.
Right.
And our mission today is to thoroughly analyze the architecture of his arguments. He posits that our traditional institutions didn't just naturally change over time.
Like organic societal shifts.
Exactly, not organic at all. He argues they were actively captured by progressive ideologies, modern feminists, and cultural Marxists.
So we're going to look at the historical timeline he presents, all the specific cultural evidence he cites, and the tactical solutions he actually offers to his readers.
But before we start looking at the mechanics of this book, we really need to explicitly state who the target audience is here.
Yes, absolutely. Because with a text like this, context is just, it's everything.
It is. This is a manifesto. It's written heavily, unabashedly, for traditionalists, for men's rights activists, and for individuals within what's often called the red-pilled manosphere.
Right. And if you belong to that demographic, or if you're simply trying to understand the history of our institutions and why this specific worldview resonates so deeply with millions of men right now, this deep dive is entirely for you.
We are going to explore exactly how this book appeals to that audience and how it constructs its core arguments.
Yeah.
But first, a really critical piece of housekeeping.
Yeah, we need to lay down the ground rules here.
We must deliver a strict, calm, and objective disclaimer. The text we are analyzing today contains highly polarized, right-wing political and cultural commentary.
Very polarized.
And we want to emphasize to you, the listener, that we are taking no sides in this discussion. We're not endorsing Conrad Riker's viewpoints, nor are we condemning them.
Our role here is strictly analytical. We're just acting as your guides to synthesize, unpack, and report on the ideas exactly as they are in the original source material.
Precisely. We're looking at how he builds his case, the rhetorical strategies he employs, the historical threads he pulls from, nothing more and nothing less.
A really vital framing for what is going to be a very intense exploration today. But right before we start pulling apart Riker's central thesis, I want to remind you to please like and subscribe to the show.
It really helps us keep doing these massive deep dives.
It does. And listen, if today's analysis hooks you, and you want to explore the primary source text for yourself to see exactly what the author is saying and how he's saying it, you can buy the ebook, Stop the Leftist Wrecking Ball, right now on Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books.
We also want to remind you that if you want to follow the author's ongoing commentary, you can find him at Conrad Riker on Substack for more of his writings.
Okay, so let's begin with the title itself. Riker uses this metaphor of a wrecking ball.
Right, the leftist wrecking ball.
Yeah, and he specifically labels the operator of that machine as cultural Marxism. He introduces this as the foundational premise of the entire book.
It's the engine of his whole theory.
According to his narrative, cultural Marxism is acting as this silent destroyer of Western heritage. And to build this argument, he traces the origins of the threat back to a very specific time and place.
Yeah, the 1920s in Germany.
Right?
The author grounds his entire historical narrative in what academics refer to as the Frankfurt School.
Okay, unpack that for us. What is the Frankfurt School in Riker's context?
Well, according to the text, to understand what is happening in American classrooms or corporate boardrooms today, you have to look back to this group of radical theorists and philosophers.
Does he name specific people?
He does. He specifically names Theodor Adorno, Max Horkheimer, Erich Fromm, and Herbert Marcuse. And Riker paints a picture of their intellectual pivot, which is central to his whole theory.
Right, because classical Marxism, the kind originally espoused by Karl Marx that was primarily focused on economics, right?
Exactly. It was built on the idea of the working class rising up to seize the means of production from the ruling class, a physical economic revolution.
But the Frankfurt School, Riker argues, they realized that the economic revolution wasn't happening the way Marx predicted.
Especially not in the advanced industrial societies of the West.
Because the working class in the West wasn't actually revolting. I mean, if anything, as the 20th century progressed, the working class was getting more comfortable.
They were. They were buying houses, driving cars, fully integrating into the capitalist system.
So how does Riker explain the leap from classical economic Marxism to this new cultural focus? Does he see culture as just a new vehicle for the same economic goals, or did the goalposts entirely change?
That is precisely the transition Riker focuses on. He points out that thinkers like Herbert Marcuse explicitly argued that the working class had become too successfully integrated into the capitalist system to even recognize their own oppression.
Ah, so they were too comfortable to revolt.
Right. The comforts of consumerism had essentially pacified them, according to Marcuse. So, according to the book, these thinkers made a strategic pivot from traditional economic grievance to cultural subversion.
So the strategy changed.
Completely. The new strategy was formulated like this. If you want to change society and dismantle capitalism, you can't just attack the economy from the outside. You have to change the culture from the inside.
You have to infiltrate the institutions that generate and sustain those cultural norms.
Exactly.
And this is what Riker refers to as the silent cultural revolution. He argues that this new ideology didn't arrive with marching armies or violent uprising.
No, it was much more subtle.
He calls it a quiet, bureaucratic seepage into the very foundations of American life. And he explicitly targets academia, the mainstream media, the entertainment industry, and even religious institutions.
The pillars of society.
Yeah. The text describes these pillars as having been hijacked by what he calls leftist parasites who are actively utilizing these platforms to teach the youth that America and traditional Western values in general are inherently oppressive.
And to anchor this theory, the text points to the utilization of critical theory.
Right, critical theory.
Riker asserts that critical theory is the primary weapon of this cultural infiltration.
How does he define it?
Well, by constantly questioning, deconstructing, and attacking societal norms. Labeling everything from the traditional nuclear family to objective standards of merit as tools of systemic oppression.
So it's about tearing down established norms.
Exactly. He argues that cultural Marxism effectively replaces objective truth with moral relativism.
Let me pause you right there, because moral relativism is one of those terms that gets thrown around a lot in these discussions. How exactly does Riker define the mechanics of moral relativism in this context?
Sure.
And why does he view it as such a lethal threat to the West?
In Riker's framework, moral relativism is the outright denial of absolute transcendent truths.
Okay.
If traditional Western civilization was built on the idea that certain things are objectively good, true, and beautiful, often rooted in Judeo-Christian ethics, moral relativism strips all of that away.
It says nothing is objectively true.
Right. It argues that morality is just a social construct created by those in power to maintain their power.
So truth is just a power dynamic.
Exactly. And Riker argues that once you convince a society that there is no objective truth, you create a vacuum.
And what fills the vacuum?
Into that vacuum, he claims, the cultural Marxists insert identity politics.
Which brings us to the real-world application of this theory for the average person. Riker claims this theoretical shift creates a culture divided entirely into victims and oppressors.
Yes, and that binary victim versus oppressor is a crucial load-bearing pillar of his thesis.
Right.
The book argues that by forcing society to view every single human interaction through the hyper-focused lens of power dynamics and identity politics, the traditional American dream is effectively dismantled.
Because it kills the idea of meritocracy.
Precisely. The fundamental American belief that you get ahead through hard work, character, and individual agency that is replaced by a system that demands outcomes based on perceived victimhood.
So Riker argues this shifts the battleground from the physical world to the psychological one, effectively rotting the culture's resilience from the inside out.
It's his central claim.
So, if the overarching strategy of this theoretical wrecking ball is to dismantle traditional power structures and redefine society into victims and oppressors, Riker identifies a very specific primary target on the ground.
He does.
The modern man.
Yes, and this is where the book gets incredibly passionate.
It really does. And where it speaks most directly to that men's rights activist demographic we mentioned earlier.
Absolutely.
The author argues that one of the most destructive offshoots of cultural Marxism is modern third-wave feminism. He draws a hard line here, claiming it has morphed from a noble pursuit of equal rights into a movement of superiority and outright misandry.
Right, the hatred of men. And Riker employs a very specific rhetorical strategy in this section to avoid being labeled just broadly anti-woman.
Yeah, he makes a distinction.
He makes a sharp historical distinction between early feminism, which he acknowledges fought for legitimate, objective goals like the right to vote and equal pay for equal work, and what he sees today.
So he's saying first and second wave feminism had a point.
He concedes that. But he argues that today's third-wave feminism is an entirely different beast. He describes it as an ideology hell-bent on demolishing men and the very concept of manhood.
The underlying assumption of this chapter is that men are no longer viewed by society as protectors and providers.
Roles that gave them historical purpose and pride.
Exactly. Instead, they are institutionally cast as inherent oppressors.
And he uses some very high-profile cultural touchstones to prove that this war on men isn't just an internet theory, but a culturally pervasive reality.
Right, like he dedicates significant space to the 2019 Gillette advertisement.
The best men can be.
Yeah. Now, a lot of our listeners will remember the massive controversy around that ad when it dropped, but what exactly does Riker focus on? What were the specific visuals or messages that he took such issue with?
Well, Riker views that 2019 Gillette ad as a watershed moment of corporate capture. The commercial depicted various scenes of men engaging in bullying, sexual harassment, and mansplaining.
Right, and then it had a call to action for men to hold each other accountable.
Yes, and Riker's analysis is that this commercial was a blatant, sweeping broadside against the entire male sex.
He didn't see it as just targeting bad behavior.
Not at all. He argues that the visual language of the ad painted all men as inherently toxic by default.
Like masculinity itself is the problem.
Exactly. Suggesting that traditional masculinity was a pathology that required social reengineering. He uses this as a prime example of how corporate media has internalized feminist talking points to publicly shame men and sell products based on male guilt.
Wow. And he traces this from corporate marketing directly into institutional science, which is a fascinating leap. He doesn't just blame Madison Avenue ad execs, he calls out the American Psychological Association.
This is a key escalation in his argument. He moves from advertising to psychology.
What did the APA do?
Riker cites the APA's official guidelines for psychological practice with boys and men. According to his reading of those guidelines, the APA essentially labeled traditional masculinity traits like stoicism, competitiveness, and the drive to protect as psychologically harmful.
He sees that as a betrayal.
A catastrophic institutional betrayal. He claims it sends a sanctioned scientific message to young boys that their natural biological instincts and behaviors are toxic.
That they need to be medicated, suppressed, or therapy out of them.
Exactly.
So we have corporate media and institutional science. Naturally, he then moves to the social and legal sphere.
Right.
Specifically targeting the Me Too movement. Now, the book acknowledges that sexual assault is a grave crime, but how does he frame the movement itself?
He frames the Me Too movement as a modern-day manifestation of the Salem witch trials.
That's a strong comparison.
Very strong. Riker builds this narrative by arguing that the movement quickly devolved from a mechanism for justice into a weapon of social terror.
Because of the lack of due process.
His core critique is exactly that, the erosion of due process. He argues that in the cultural climate created by Me Too, men were presumed guilty in the court of public opinion the very moment an accusation was made.
Effectively destroying their careers and lives before any legal defense could even be mounted. And to anchor this theory, the text points to specific data and highly publicized cases. He knows his audience values data that reflects their lived experiences.
He does.
So he points to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, noting that women now outnumber men in both college attendance and completion.
But he doesn't frame this as a victory for women.
No, not at all. He frames it as proof of systemic bias against men.
Right. Riker argues that the modern education system has been meticulously redesigned to cater to the learning styles and temperaments of girls.
While boys' natural energy and physical aggression are treated as behavioral problems.
He specifically zeroes in on the rates of ADHD diagnoses in boys.
Yes, he claims boys are being heavily overmedicated for ADHD just for being boys. He describes it almost as diagnosing a fake disease simply because the modern, sedentary classroom environment cannot handle natural male energy.
And he goes further. He argues that policies like affirmative action and corporate diversity quotas are actively pushing qualified men out of the job market.
Leading to a massive generation of men who feel completely marginalized,
Purposeless.
undervalued by the civilization they helped build.
And to bolster the intellectual weight of these claims, Riker aggregates voices from other prominent authors in this space. He frequently leans on Christina Hoff Sommers and her pivotal book, The War Against Boys.
Oh yeah, that's a classic in this sphere.
He also cites Suzanne Venker's The War on Men, and even the cultural critiques of comedian Adam Carolla. By synthesizing these different voices, Riker creates this compounding narrative that men are not just individually failing, but are under a coordinated institutional attack.
But the emotional centerpiece of this entire argument, and this part is really intense, is his deep dive into the mattress girl case at Columbia University.
Yes.
For the listener who might need a quick refresher, this was the case of Emma Solkovich in 2014. She carried a 50-pound mattress around campus for a year to protest her university, allegedly mishandling her rape accusation against a fellow student, Paul Nungesser.
That's right.
Why does Riker focus so heavily on an incident from 2014? How does he use it as an archetype?
Because Riker uses the mattress girl case as the foundational archetype of everything he believes is wrong with modern institutions. He points out that the accused student, Nungesser, was ultimately cleared by the university's internal investigation.
And cleared by the police.
Cleared by the police, who declined to press charges. And he later settled a lawsuit against Columbia for how they allowed him to be publicly harassed.
So for Riker, this saga isn't just a campus dispute.
No, it is the ultimate undeniable proof of how the media, academic institutions, and even art critics are willing to completely ruin a young man's life based on unproven allegations.
Simply because servicing a feminist narrative is deemed more culturally important than objective truth and due process.
That's exactly his takeaway.
So, connecting this back to you, the listener, what is the actionable takeaway here? The book isn't designed to just be a list of grievances to make men angry.
It's a call to action.
Right. Riker urges men to actively reclaim what he calls positive masculinity. He demands pushback against toxic femininity, which he defines as the pervasive cultural shaming of men just for exhibiting male traits.
He wants his readers to unapologetically restore their traditional roles.
As protectors, builders, and providers, arguing that a healthy, functioning society absolutely depends on strong, capable men who are not ashamed of their nature.
And this restoration of traditional roles naturally leads into his next major area of concern. The logic flows quite seamlessly here.
How so?
Well, if the institutions have marginalized the men, the traditional protectors, then who is left undefended?
Ah, the children.
The children. Riker argues that the progressive left, having compromised the adult institutions, has now turned its full attention to the most vulnerable, impressionable group in society.
This brings us to a highly charged section of the text, the battleground of childhood. Riker doesn't mince words here. He claims that the public education system has been completely hijacked.
Transforming local schools from places of academic instruction into ideological indoctrination centers.
The core emotional argument here is that children are being systematically robbed of their innocence. And fascinatingly, he traces the origin of this specific cultural decay back much further than most might expect.
Way back.
All the way back to the 1950s.
Yes. To understand his critique of modern education, we have to look at his critique of Alfred Kinsey.
Okay, let's dive into that.
In the late 1940s and early 1950s, the Kinsey Institute published highly controversial reports on human sexuality that really shocked post-war America.
The Kinsey reports.
Right, and Riker dedicates significant time to dismantling Kinsey. He argues that Kinsey's methodology was deeply intentionally flawed.
Because of the sample sizes.
Because he relied on non-representative samples, including prison populations and known sex offenders, to create data that artificially normalized deviant behaviors.
And how does he connect a 1950s academic study to what is happening in an elementary school in 2026?
He argues that Kinsey's flawed science provided the false academic legitimacy needed to build the modern framework of comprehensive sex education.
Okay, I see.
According to the book, Kinsey moved the baseline of what was considered normal, and that allowed organizations decades later to push boundaries further and further.
Riker expresses absolute outrage at organizations like Planned Parenthood, ECSES, the Sexuality Information and Education Council of the United States, and even guidelines published by the United Nations.
He claims these entities are utilizing the academic cover provided by Kinsey to promote highly explicit material to young children.
Under the deceptive guise of health education and inclusivity.
Exactly.
The anecdotes he shares from the text are clearly selected to maximize shock value, right? To highlight the perceived danger of this curriculum.
They're very alarming to his readers.
He mentions specific instances of kindergarten boys being introduced to concepts of transgenderism. He argues forcefully that 5-year-olds are simply not cognitively or emotionally equipped to process incredibly complex adult concepts about gender identity and sexual orientation.
And he goes further, citing highly controversial cases where schools in Colorado were allegedly teaching middle school students about specific, explicit sexual acts.
And schools in California providing children as young as 10 with literature about masturbation and sex toys.
Right. Riker refuses to view this as education. He frames it entirely as the state-sponsored promotion of sexual anarchy.
But he doesn't just call it immoral, which would be a religious argument. He pivots to a psychological argument, which is a very effective rhetorical move.
It's very shrewd.
He claims this early exposure is actively damaging children's mental health.
Precisely. To back this up, he cites behavioral scientists like Dr. Paul Dolan. He uses their work to argue that children who are exposed to radical, boundary-pushing sex education experience significantly higher rates of anxiety, depression, and even suicidal ideation.
So the author's thesis here is quite dark.
It is.
He suggests that left-wing educators are intentionally alienating children from the stabilizing forces of traditional family values and biological realities.
Leaving them intentionally confused, anxious, and easier to mold ideologically.
Which provides the perfect transition into what might be the most philosophically dense part of the book, the attack on biological reality and queer theory.
Yes.
This is where Riker takes out his intellectual sledgehammer. But before we look at his critique, we need to make sure we're all on the same page with the terminology.
Absolutely.
The book throws around queer theory and postmodernism quite a bit. How does Riker define postmodernism in the context of this book, and why is it the villain?
In Riker's analysis, postmodernism is a philosophical movement that emerged in the mid to late 20th century that is fundamentally skeptical of grand narratives and objective truth.
So it's a rejection of the Enlightenment.
Exactly. Where the Enlightenment believed in reason, science, and universal truths, postmodernism argues that what we call truth is really just a narrative constructed by whoever holds power in society.
So language, science, societal norms, they aren't objective.
They are tools of control, according to postmodernism.
Okay, so if postmodernism says there is no objective truth, only power dynamics, how does that birth the queer theory?
Well, Riker describes queer theory as the mutant, highly weaponized offspring of postmodernism.
The mutant offspring.
His words, essentially. If postmodernism deconstructs truth broadly, queer theory specifically deconstructs biological reality. It's an academic framework that explicitly rejects the idea that there are only two sexes determined objectively by X and Y chromosomes.
And Riker traces this academic lineage back to the 1990s, dropping names like Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida as the postmodernist godfathers who lead the groundwork.
Foucault, of course, focused heavily on how societal institutions use the definitions of sexuality and madness to exert power.
But Riker reserves his sharpest, most sustained critique for Judith Butler. Specifically, her highly influential 1990 book, Gender Trouble.
Judith Butler is central to his argument. She is famous for pioneering the concept of performative gender.
Performative gender. Explain that for the audience.
This is the idea that gender isn't something you inherently are based on biology.
Right.
Rather, it is something you do. It's a continuous performance.
A set of behaviors.
Right. A set of scripts that society forces upon you from birth based on your anatomy.
So society says you were born with male anatomy, therefore you must perform the script of masculinity, play with trucks, hide your emotions, be aggressive.
And Butler argues that by repeating these performances, we create the illusion that gender is a natural biological fact.
When really it's just a social construct.
Exactly. And Riker attempts to logically deconstruct this entire framework. He employs a really fascinating rhetorical strategy here.
What does he do?
He argues that Butler's theory of performative gender is built on incredibly unstable logical ground. He posits that if gender is merely a performance, as she claims, then there must inherently be an audience evaluating that performance.
Right.
And that audience must be evaluating it based on pre-existing established biological ideas of what a man or a woman naturally is.
So the performance requires a standard.
Therefore, he claims, her theory secretly relies on the very biological gender binary it is attempting to dispute.
That's a clever philosophical counter. He also attacks the broader leftist reliance on the social construct narrative itself.
He makes a really sharp logical counter-argument that appeals directly to his audience's sense of reason.
He essentially asks, if gender is just a social construct and therefore completely invalid and arbitrary, why don't progressive academics apply that exact same logic to other concepts they hold dear?
Right. Why aren't things like universal human rights, environmental justice, or even the concept of democracy dismissed as mere social constructs that can be ignored?
He views the selective, weaponized use of the social construct argument as proof that it's not a genuine philosophical stance, but just a cynical tool designed specifically to dismantle biological truth.
Building on this philosophical critique, the book shifts from the academic theories of the 1990s to the very real, very physical realities of the modern transgender movement.
And Riker views the societal embrace of this movement with profound alarm.
He does. And to build his case, he extensively cites conservative thinkers like Ryan T. Anderson, author of When Harry Became Sally, and Christopher D. Ince, who wrote The Transgender Empire.
Through these citations, Riker outlines his specific, visceral fears regarding how this theory is playing out in hospitals and schools.
And those fears are intensely specific. He talks at length about the horror of irreversible gender-related surgeries, mastectomies, puberty blockers, hormone therapies being performed on young, physically healthy people.
He points a massive accusatory finger at social media platforms, too.
Specifically TikTok and Instagram.
Yeah, he claims these platforms are acting as algorithmic radicalization engines.
He uses the concept of social contagion here.
Social contagion, like a virus.
Sort of. We can compare it to historical teenage fads, like certain fashion trends or even the spread of eating disorders in the 90s. But Riker notes that this isn't a harmless fad, it's a biological intervention.
Right. He argues that impressionable teenagers, particularly young girls who are naturally experiencing the awkwardness and discomfort of puberty, are being convinced by influencers that their normal developmental angst is actually gender dysphoria.
They are encouraged to reject their biology for internet clout and a sense of belonging in an online community.
He also highlights the highly contentious, increasingly visible issue of biological females being forced to compete against biological males in women's sports.
Which is a huge flashpoint.
Huge. He frames this not as an issue of inclusion, but as a direct, undeniable attack by trans activists on the hard-won Title IX rights of women, effectively erasing female athletic achievement.
But perhaps the most emotional anchor he uses in this entire section on biological reality is the story of James Younger.
Ah, the Texas custody case.
Right. For context for our listeners, this was a highly publicized, deeply polarizing legal battle starting around 2019. It involved a mother who was transitioning her young child, James, to live as a girl named Luna, against the fierce public objections of the child's father, Jeffrey Younger.
Why does Riker lean so heavily on this specific custody battle? I mean, out of all the cases he could have chosen.
Because it perfectly encapsulates his ultimate fear regarding state power versus the family. Riker uses the James Younger story as a heartbreaking and infuriating example of traditional parental rights being trampled by a progressive judicial and medical system.
He frames it as a father desperately trying to protect his son from irreversible harm, while the state actively supports what Riker explicitly labels as state-sanctioned child abuse.
Driven by the academic theories of Judith Butler and Michel Foucault, it connects the high-minded academic theory directly to the destruction of a family in Texas.
If we step back and look at the progression of Riker's argument so far, we see a very clear, methodical trajectory. First, the cultural Marxists infiltrate the institutions. Second, they wage a psychological war on men to weaken the traditional protectors of the family. Third, they target the children through the education system.
And fourth, they dismantle the very concept of biological reality to create maximum societal confusion.
This logical chain leads us directly to the next major pillar of his book, where Riker zooms out from the micro level of families and schools to identify the overarching villains who are allegedly funding and orchestrating this entire wrecking ball.
Yes, this is where we look at the macro level forces. Who is holding the joystick for this cultural wrecking ball?
Right.
Riker pivots his focus to the globalist elites. We're no longer just talking about gender studies professors. We are talking about major, incredibly wealthy international players.
Like who?
He focuses heavily on billionaire philanthropist George Soros, the World Economic Forum spearheaded by Klaus Schwab, and the overarching bureaucracy of the United Nations.
Now, a skeptic might ask, Why would multi-billionaire capitalists like George Soros or the corporate leaders at the World Economic Forum want to promote cultural Marxism or socialism? That seems completely counterintuitive.
It does.
How does Riker square that circle?
Riker addresses that apparent contradiction through the concept of the smokescreen. His theory is that these globalist elites are not genuinely passionate about transgender rights or critical race theory or comprehensive sex education on a moral level.
So they don't actually care about the ideology.
Not at all. He claims they are using these deeply divisive, progressive ideologies, along with concepts like multiculturalism and open borders, as a massive orchestrated distraction.
A distraction to achieve what end?
The absolute consolidation of global power. The book argues that by promoting cultural division, eroding national borders, and pushing socialist economic policies, these elites aim to strip individual nations of their sovereignty and destroy national identity.
So it's about breaking down the nation state.
The ultimate goal, Riker asserts, is to usher in a technocratic New World Order, a system where a small, unrepresentative, unelected global elite has absolute top-down control over a compliant, dependent, and culturally fractured global population.
A population that is too busy fighting over gender pronouns to realize their wealth and freedoms have been stolen.
That's his exact argument.
To prove why this socialist, globalist vision is a nightmare, he doesn't just rely on theory. He points to recent historical examples, specifically citing the collapse of Venezuela.
Yeah, that's a potent example for his audience.
He dedicates space to highlighting how Venezuela, which was once one of the most prosperous, resource-rich nations in South America, adopted socialist policies and rapidly descended into hyperinflation, mass poverty, starvation, and total economic collapse.
He warns his readers that Venezuela isn't an anomaly. It is the exact blueprint and future the globalists have planned for the West.
And what is the ultimate obstacle standing in the way of this New World Order? According to Riker, it is the traditional nuclear family. The book views the nuclear family, specifically defined as a married father and mother raising their biological children, as the absolute bedrock of human civilization.
Why is the family such a threat to the state in Riker's view?
Well,
Because the nuclear family is an independent unit of power. It is the institution that provides economic stability, cultural continuity, and crucially, an allegiance that supersedes loyalty to the government.
right. If you are loyal to your family and your God, you are much harder for the state to control.
Therefore, from the perspective of the globalist elites, the nuclear family must be dismantled so the individual becomes entirely dependent on the state.
And he uses Sweden as his primary cautionary tale to illustrate how this dismantling works in practice. Now, Sweden is often held up by progressive politicians as a democratic socialist utopia, high taxes, massive social safety nets, excellent health care.
But Riker flips that narrative entirely.
He does.
He points out that since the 1960s, Sweden has aggressively experimented with progressive family policies, highly subsidizing single parenthood and shifting child-rearing responsibilities from the parents directly to the state.
And the result of this utopia, according to Riker, he cites statistics claiming that today a staggering 47% of households in Sweden are single-person households.
And over half of all children are born out of wedlock.
He paints a picture of a society that is economically cared for but culturally desolate. He correlates this systematic dismantling of marriage with skyrocketing rates of depression, loneliness, and profound social isolation in the country.
He argues that when the state replaces the family, the human soul suffers.
Bringing back to America, Riker argues that progressive policies here are actively encouraging this same breakdown.
He cites hard statistics from Yale University and the National Center for Family and Marriage Research to show the rapidly rising rates of fatherlessness and single-parent households over the last 50 years.
And he posits a highly controversial theory here.
He does. That the modern welfare state, working in tandem with feminist ideology, actively and financially incentivizes women to rely on the government rather than a husband.
This effectively makes the state the new patriarch of the household.
Further emasculating men and leaving children without the vital presence of a father.
It's an incredibly bleak, comprehensive picture he paints of institutional capture. But Riker anticipates a question from his readers. If this destruction is so obvious, why aren't more people speaking out against it?
Which brings us to the mechanisms the left uses to enforce compliance and silence dissent.
We're talking about the war on free speech and the corruption of religion.
Let's start with the enforcement arm. Cancel culture and wokeism. Riker does not hold back here.
Not at all. He explicitly labels cancel culture as modern-day McCarthyism.
Yes, he views wokeism not as an awareness of social injustice, but as a rigid authoritarian ideology that demands absolute ideological conformity.
He argues that it punishes even the slightest dissent with total social, professional, and economic excommunication.
He asserts that the foundational Western value of free speech is under unprecedented siege, and not necessarily by government censors, but by digital mobs on social media who act as the willing enforcers of cultural Marxism.
To prove the terrifying reach of this mob, he lists specific high-profile casualties. He wants to show that no one is safe, regardless of their status.
Right, he mentions comedian Kevin Hart, who was forced to step down from hosting the Oscars over decade-old jokes made on Twitter.
He brings up J.K. Rowling, the billionaire author of Harry Potter.
Rowling's case is particularly important to Riker's argument. He notes that she faced a massive sustained backlash, death threats, and boycott attempts simply for stating the biological reality that sex is real.
And arguing that allowing biological men into women's spaces could endanger women.
For Riker, if the mob can come for a beloved billionaire like Rowling, they can come for anyone.
He also references James Damore, which is a crucial case study for the tech industry. Damore was the software engineer who was famously fired from Google in 2017.
Yes.
What is Riker's read on the Damore memo?
Well, Damore's crime, according to Riker's analysis, was simply circulating an internal memo that cited mainstream evolutionary biology and psychology to explain the gender gap in the tech industry.
Rather than blaming it entirely on systemic sexism.
Exactly. By challenging the company's diversity policies with biological data, Damore committed ideological heresy and was swiftly purged.
Riker even points to historical figures, noting that progressive academics have even attempted to cancel figures like Frantz Fanon for not perfectly aligning with modern sensibilities.
And to bolster the psychological argument behind why this censorship is happening, Riker references Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff's highly influential book, The Coddling of the American Mind.
He argues that this culture of safetyism creates a society of fragile, fearful victims who demand protection from words.
He also cites Frank Furedi's free speech and the transcendent self, suggesting that wokeism doesn't just silence your speech, it actually destroys the individual's ability to even form their own independent identity, because they are constantly terrified of stepping out of line.
But the leftist wrecking ball doesn't stop at secular institutions like Google or Hollywood. In what might be the most distressing chapter for his traditionalist audience, Riker claims the wrecking ball has deeply infiltrated the church itself.
Through what he calls progressive theology.
This is a fascinating pivot. He claims that the church, which for 2 millennia should have been the ultimate unyielding fortress of traditional values and objective truth, is being actively corrupted from the inside by its own leaders.
Riker expresses profound, almost mournful dismay that major religious institutions and denominations have adopted progressive political agendas, disguising them under the biblical language of social justice and loving your neighbor.
He sharply criticizes churches for pushing initiatives like the Green New Deal from the pulpit,
which he views as a secular, socialist economic takeover wrapped in environmentalism, having absolutely nothing to do with saving souls.
He also specifically calls out churches that have embraced teaching critical race theory to their congregations.
He argues that CRT divides the body of the church by race, forcing white congregants to repent for the sin of systemic privilege.
Preaching collective, historical guilt rather than individual, spiritual redemption through Christ.
And he is especially critical, fiercely so, of religious leaders who publicly showed support for the Black Lives Matter movement.
Right. Riker explicitly describes BLM not as a civil rights movement, but as a self-avowed Marxist organization whose formally stated goals originally included the disruption of the Western prescribed nuclear family.
The very institution that church is supposedly mandated by God to protect.
He views progressive theology as a Trojan horse, twisting biblical scripture to fit a leftist political narrative, and he calls for a desperately needed, uncompromising return to traditional Orthodox scriptural interpretation.
Okay, so we have traversed a massive amount of ground. We've explored the origins of cultural Marxism, the systemic war on men, the battle for children's minds, the assault on biological reality, the globalist economic agenda, and the censorship of dissent.
This brings us to the final act of the book. Riker has laid out this vast, interconnected conspiracy. But he doesn't leave his audience in a state of despair. He offers a highly tactical playbook.
The solutions.
What is the game plan to actually stop this wrecking ball?
The solutions he offers are highly actionable and operate on multiple levels, personal, local, and national. At the individual level, his primary directive is, do not be silent.
Speak up.
He tells his readers that they must develop a thick skin. They must consciously refuse to be bullied into apologies by cancel culture mobs, because apologizing, in his view, only emboldens the mob.
Practically speaking, he advises abandoning mainstream tech monopolies, getting off Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and migrating to alternative, parallel social media platforms and economies that explicitly protect free speech and don't censor conservative viewpoints.
He says you must employ counterspeech. When they try to silence you, you don't retreat. You speak louder and with more conviction.
And in the workplace or the university, always relentlessly demand due process in the face of HR investigations or mob justice.
But he argues that the most crucial immediate battles are not being fought in Washington, D.C. They're being fought at the local level.
Local politics.
He urges parents to become deeply uncomfortably involved in their children's education. This means aggressively reviewing teaching materials and syllabi, organizing with other parents to attend school board meetings, and directly confronting administrators who are pushing radical sex education or gender studies.
And if the public schools refuse to change course, he doesn't suggest compromising. He strongly advocates for the nuclear option.
Pulling kids out of the public school system entirely.
He champions the massive expansion of homeschooling, framing it not just as an educational choice, but as an act of political defiance, and the only way to create a secure, uncontaminated space for transmitting traditional values to the next generation.
Economically and politically, he instructs his audience to vote strictly for conservative candidates who prioritize an America First agenda, rejecting any politician tied to globalist institutions.
He encourages his readers to vote with their wallets, prioritizing buying from businesses that openly support American workers and traditional values, and actively boycotting corporations that push woke marketing.
Ultimately, Riker's book concludes not with a dry summary, but with a passionate, highly emotional rallying cry.
He is essentially calling for cultural warriors.
He wants fighters who are willing to stand up unapologetically for the beauty of traditional values, for the scientific reality of biological sex, and for the absolute sanctity of the nuclear family, regardless of the social cost.
To elevate this rallying cry, he utilizes quotes from historical heavyweights to inspire his base and align his movement with historical struggles for freedom.
He quotes Voltaire on the fundamental right to say what people don't want to hear.
He quotes Thomas Jefferson on the Tree of Liberty.
He cites the existentialist Albert Camus on the idea of defying an oppressive world simply by choosing to exist freely within it.
And remarkably, he even quotes the great abolitionist Frederick Douglass, utilizing his famous line, "Without struggle, there is no progress," to frame this current cultural battle as a righteous fight for liberation.
He frames all of this resistance, this refusal to comply, as the dawn of what he calls a conservative renaissance.
As we synthesize this entire deep dive, it is crucial to reiterate our objective stance as your guides today. We have traversed a highly polarized, deeply intense landscape, exploring Conrad Riker's fierce assertions about cultural Marxism, the institutional emasculation of men, the ideological perversion of education, and the globalist threat to the family unit.
Exactly. Whether you personally view these progressive cultural shifts as a necessary, compassionate evolution of a society trying to become more inclusive, or whether you agree with Riker that they represent a destructive wrecking ball designed to destroy Western civilization, understanding these deeply held perspectives is absolutely crucial.
Millions of people, particularly young men, resonate profoundly with the arguments in this book.
To navigate today's deeply divided cultural and political landscape, one must comprehend the fears, the vocabulary, the historical framework, and the deep motivations driving this conservative renaissance. You cannot understand the current political map without understanding this terrain.
And that leads me to a final, provocative thought for you to ponder long after this deep dive ends. We've just spent an extensive amount of time looking at a worldview that believes reality itself, biology, history, morality, is under institutional attack.
Right.
If our society fundamentally cannot agree on objective reality, if we can't agree on the basic definition of biological sex, if we can't agree on the fundamental purpose of an education system, if we can't agree on what constitutes a family or a fair justice system, how does a democratic society continue to function?
It's a massive problem.
When the two sides of the political aisle are no longer even speaking the same language or living in the same shared reality, how do we govern ourselves without fracturing? It's something to seriously mull over.
A profound and unsettling question to end on.
Before we go, a quick reminder. If you want to read the source material for yourself, dive into the specific data points he uses, and see the full, unfiltered scope of his arguments, you should check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy Stop the Leftist Wrecking Ball by Conrad Riker.
And remember, if you want to see how he applies this framework to the daily news cycle, follow the author, Conrad Riker, at Substack for his latest essays and cultural commentary.
Finally, please make sure to like and subscribe to our feed so you never miss one of these deep dives. We love unpacking these complex, challenging sources for you. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and thanks for listening.